she is not just an expert on artificial intelligence ethics and bias, but she's an expert on teaching it, which is incredibly important in this moment of AI, not just spring, but hot summer. The hype is real, but it is incredibly important, Irina, right now to understand what bias and ethics are and how to teach it. So let's kind of start foundationally. From your perspective, what are some of the key components of effectively communicating and teaching AI ethics?
Well, first of all, let me say that it's not limited just to teaching students, although it's hugely
Yeah.
important to, first of all, explain to all students what AI is and where they should use it and where they should not. But it's also deeply important to train the future generation of AI technologists and AI ethics. Having said that, all of us, including those of us who might be described as experts, feel like the ground is constantly changing under our feet, right? As the developments in AI happen, the ethical analysis has to sort of be redone over and over again. So we have some broad understandings of some of the ethical issues related to AI, many of which are not commonly discussed. Like we often talk about bias in AI, and it's very important and it needs to be addressed, but we talk much less, for example, about the environmental impact of various people playing with these models just to see what they come up with. All of that has an environmental cost that is growing. So there's just a lot to educate the public about, a lot to educate all of us about, a lot to educate regulators about. And I feel like aside from those of us in academia, the people who are actually driving the technology, the businesses that are putting these tools out into society, have to do a much better job of educating us.
Uh, Before I get ahead of ourselves here, let's kind of rewind a bit. I know that we can fill entire curriculum courses on defining what are ethics and bias, but in the context of modern generative artificial intelligence, what do we mean when we talk about ethics and bias?
If we're focused specifically on generative AI, which is the flavor of the day in terms of images and voice and audio and text like ChatGPT, some of the issues that we're talking about are about the bias that it sort of ingests from its training data and then puts out in its outputs potentially if companies are not careful. There are also the ethical issues around the rights of the people who created the data that's now being used to train the AI models. So not just, legal issues related to copyright and fair use, but what is fair to the people who actually created the underlying data. There are, again, the questions of environmental impacts of all of this, and the broader concern about these imperfect tools being deployed into society, the questions about the ethics of deployment. How do you explain what it is that you've created and what you're prompting people to do without hyping it so that they end up using it in all kinds of places where it doesn't belong? You've probably heard the stories about the fact that a brief was submitted in federal court that had been drafted with ChatGPT or one of the other generative AIs, and it made up cases. So those are the kinds of examples where I think we all realize, oh, there's a deep misunderstanding among a lot of people about what these tools are and what they do.
Um, there's a lot to unpack there, but I wonder that maybe the first thing I'm kind of curious about is we are, or it appears as though we are racing ahead without addressing a lot of these questions. Is there a way, or do you have suggestions on how to address these kind of big issues, kind of while the train is moving real fast down the track?
Yeah, one key issue that I think is underappreciated is just the importance of considering who the stakeholders are in some of these instances. Who are the various
Hmm.
people and groups who are going to be impacted? And having that conversation before the technology is developed or before it's deployed, at least, is so important. And making sure that one of the things we do when we talk to students or when we talk to technologists, for example, is we will work through an ethics case study, just a short case study. And we ask them who are the stakeholders involved, and having that conversation, just thinking about who are the people impacted and having it in a group, not just sort of sitting by yourself, but having this collective brainstorm about the stakeholders is so powerful, because you can't really do the rest of the analysis. I think many technologists think about, balancing benefits versus harms, right? And often they will say, well, the technology on balance is more beneficial, even if we understand the harms. But you can't really have that conversation if you haven't considered all the stakeholders. So that part, if I think more people did it, and again, more people did it really thoughtfully and in depth, would bring us a long way toward addressing the harms that otherwise we see happening.
What are some of the potential risks or harms in the short term? I know often in AI we like to kind of think about this long term, especially right now we're hearing a lot about the existential risk and what could happen in the long term future. But what are the short term potential harms if we get this
They're not
wrong?
even they're not even potential. They're not short term because they're ongoing. We have
Hmm.
seen the harms caused by various AI tools being put in context, like determining who should go to jail or for how long, or trying to identify, fraud in welfare benefits and kicking hundreds of thousands of people off of welfare rolls before it turns out that a model had more than 90% false positives rates. This happened already, and lawsuits follow, and then 10 years later maybe somebody gets some redress. But this is, the questions of bias and of just simply models that are um, pitched and not checked, not audited to see that they work as intended, is a huge current problem.
Um, so how do we empower these various stakeholders? And look, I might be projecting a little bit, but for me at least, it feels a little disempowering. Like I can't really control the speed of technological innovation, let alone this rapid development of AI. Um, but it impacts my life. And I'm sure everyone watching kind of feels a similar feeling of like, well, this technology is very powerful, but I don't have a role in its development. So, how do we empower society and these stakeholders that you mentioned to not just understand the ethical implications, but ways that they can maybe exert a little more control over their lives or this evolution of technology?
I think it's so important that we don't feel disempowered and that we understand that we are just talking about right now software technologies, just like other technologies we have seen before. There is nothing natural about their adoption and integration into everything under the sun. This is something that is done by businesses. And so we have power as consumers to use things or not use them, or to push businesses not to integrate AI into services that we think are problematic. We have power as voters to vote for legislators who might actually stop some of the excesses. And we have power to call out. I think journalists have a huge role to play in identifying the limitations, that, again, sometimes the marketing departments don't clarify ahead of time. Educators have power. We all individually have power to talk around our dinner tables and to our neighbors about, the ones who know a little bit more than others, to kind of help clarify what is going on with AI and that it's not this force of nature. And what I think is most absurd is when you see business leaders sound like they feel disempowered And I'm sure you've seen and heard critics saying, well, it's like you're running Jurassic Park, and feel like there's nothing you could do about it. Well, you could not have created it, you could shut it down. I mean, there are actual people who really do have the power to do a lot more than the rest of us. So we should call on them to use that power for good and not just to ring warnings, but to take matters into their hands.
I'm glad you enumerated those controls that we do have, and it sounds like demystification. This is, like you said a few times, this is just software running. It's not necessarily sentient.
I
I
think demystification is the first key step, and I think that's important for all of the groups that I mentioned.
so you also touched on something that I rarely hear technologists talk about, and that's the environmental impact of artificial intelligence. It takes a lot of energy to train these systems and more energy per search or per computation to create a generative AI output than a search output. Can you put that into perspective for us, though? What is the real environmental impact of the AI era, and are there ways that maybe with scale, the environmental costs could come down?
I don't have hard numbers, and I think some of those are actually hard to come by because many companies don't exactly go out of their way to share what the real costs are. But yes, I think there are opportunities there. And again, we won't reach for what some are calling green AI unless we discuss this as a very important ethical issues that should come up just as the bias issues come up, just as the labor issues come up, just as the privacy issues come up. These are all really important issues that need to be addressed. Another one that I don't hear technologists mention often, by the way, are the labor issues not related to the potential unemployment and replacement of people by AI, but for example, the work being done by data labelers. When was the last time you heard a conversation about the ethics of data labeling? The working conditions of the people who do that, the implications of the subjectivity that's involved in data labeling and the implications for the bigger tools. That's partly why we have the bias issues that we have. And it's just one of those issues that tends to fly under the radar.
Um, we we do know that there are conversations about regulation happening right now, and if we look at even recent history, there was regulation in social media was kind of a laughable topic. In fact, it was kind of humorous to watch some of these hearings and to see the um, lack of understanding that many of our elected representatives had about social media technology. Now that we're in this artificial intelligence era, what are the even if our current policy makers aren't capable of really digesting and understanding the technology, and it's hard, understandably, this is challenging stuff, but what are the regulations that we should be pushing for? What would allow for technological innovation to happen, and for us to benefit from technological innovation, but still regulate it so that it is safe?
Yeah, so let me push back a little bit on the notion that regulators and lawmakers are as unprepared for AI as they were for social
Mm.
media, because I think some lessons were learned. And you can see that from the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that came out of the White House Office of Science and Technology, where the people involved worked very closely with technologists in putting together that document. So they don't have to be these very removed policymakers not understanding the issues. I think we do have some policymakers who understand and are pushing for the right things. In terms of what laws might come and not stifle innovation, we have sort of the low-hanging fruit, which is just identifying things as AI generated, for example. Those kinds of laws and requirements are probably coming so that we won't be deceived as much as possible. These are imperfect solutions. But there are also existing regulations like the various privacy laws, which might very well impact the kind of data sets that can be collected and can be used to train these models. So it's not just a matter of sort of coming up with new laws, but enforcing the ones that we have. And we've seen the FTC and other agencies flex their muscles in this area and doing things, going as far as to order companies to disgorge their algorithms, i.e. destroy their algorithms and destroy the data that they had collected on which the companies trained them. So there's a lot that is happening. It's just hard to keep up with the speed of the deployment of these tools.
I'm also glad you touched on the data that was used to train a lot of these big large language model generative AI systems. Many of them used kind of the corpus of the internet, and maybe some social networks like Reddit were given a priority. But what rights do we have as internet users with these new AI systems? I'm sure that many people who used and published content to the internet in the last decade didn't really anticipate that their data would be used to train AI. So what are our rights?
I think our rights have been so far vastly ignored, and we don't know exactly. We can talk about, moral rights and the frustration of people not being given the opportunity to consent or refuse to consent to their quote unquote content, which might be very personal, written or documented stuff being used to train these models. But I think we're going to see relatively soon some answers about what legal rights we might have, right? Because there are now copyright battles, copyright lawsuits playing out, and there will be interesting questions about what constitutes fair use. And there's, of course, a legal definition of what is fair, and then a general sense that some of the stuff just is not fair to the people that, as you said, uploaded content without in any way intending that it be used to train models that would then make money for companies and give nothing, not even the right of refusal, to the people who actually generated the content.